You're listening to This is Yoga Therapy. I'm your host, Michelle Lawrence, and I've had the opportunity to interview many of those who are making a difference at the intersections of yoga and health. And I'm here to share with you their stories and conversations. Thanks for listening. In today's episode, I interviewed Cheri Dostal Ryba. Cheri has devoted over 20 years to embodied inquiry and transformation as a movement educator, a fitness trainer, dancer, CIAYT yoga therapist, speaker, and author. Her approach weaves the cyclical wisdom of nature with nervous system and polyvagal informed whole person pelvic care. Cheri published her first book in 2022, Pelvic Yoga Therapy for the Whole Woman, a Professional Guide. With abundant sound effects and heart-led facilitation, she helps women remember and trust their instincts and authentic expression. Cheri served as a founding co-director and lead faculty of the accredited training program Alchemy Yoga Therapy. She continues to guest lecture and provide mentorship, and she has spoken at the international conferences Sitar and Misty. Annually, she facilitates a 9-month women's embodiment group online called Inhabit, and she'll be hosting the Satisfy Women's Sensual Embodiment Retreat November 13th through 16th this year, 2025. She lives in Madison, Wisconsin, with her husband and her 2 daughters. And it's really great to reconnect with you, Cheri, and have you on the podcast today. We met, I don't even know how many years ago now, at a Sitar conference. And I vividly remember our meeting and hanging out. And so it's really great to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I was reflecting too, like, when did we first connect? And I think it was Sitar 2019, and
I think
was
you're right.
pregnant, and we presented in the CIC roundtable that year.
Yeah, that was cool.
A lot has happened since then.
A lot has happened since then. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's hear what you've been up to. I'd love for you just to start by kind of introducing yourself a bit, share with our listeners a bit about your background and what put you on your path with yoga and then yoga therapy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. What put me on the path to yoga was really like a home that I found in movement, more broadly speaking. One of my most vivid memories is marching up and down my gravel driveway, preparing for a middle school tryout for the majorettes, which then led to dance team and a Bachelor of Arts degree in dance. And while I was a student on campus, I worked as a group exercise instructor, personal trainer with one-on-one clients in the gym, so movement and exercise has always kind of been my thing and has given me a lot of strength and peace and trust in myself, right? Like the physicality of working through and with my body brought so many benefits that I kind of didn't realize I needed as a young adult.
Good that you had it, right?
Yeah. So, looking back, I'm really grateful that somehow my personal interest and passion and curiosity led to a really fulfilling career. This has been my full-time thing my whole working life, really. So yeah, after dance, I worked shortly as a fitness center manager, personal trainer, etc. All of a sudden was terminated unexpectedly and became self-employed in my mid-20s. And through working with those clients and building my own practice, found my way back sort of to yoga, teaching yoga formally in a hospital setting, was referred by a friend and colleague, and then thought I might as well get trained. I should probably have an official certificate if I'm teaching this, even though I already had years of experience and other qualifications. Started looking for a local mentor and did private lessons with a well-respected teacher in the area. And when I asked her, I want to get trained, I want to get certified, who do you recommend? she held up a copy of Donna Farhi's book, Yoga, Mind, Body, Spirit. And I said, "Oh, who's that?" Totally naive. I didn't even know who she was or had never seen the book before. So I started reading, and the approach with weaving in developmental movement patterns and somatic inquiry and the rich scholarship that Donna Farhi has done with yoga philosophy and the ethics all really spoke to me. So I ended up on a plane to New Zealand for my first training to go study for the month with Donna Farhi and her team. And that led to many years as an assistant and senior associate, helping her with her intensives around the US. It's been really quite an adventure, actually. And now I'm grateful that I've had those years of deep study and practice and very, very rich, important mentorship early on in my career, where now I'm, as we were speaking before we hit record, we're now in the trenches as parents and business owners and all those other hats that we wear. So yeah, there's still nourishment that I draw from all of those experiences in my teaching now.
That's so wonderful. I don't think I knew all that about your background, and it really speaks to me. And yeah, like life is so different now. I bet you can't imagine yourself doing that type of learning and training now, right? With the way life is. And I even think about, when I studied yoga and yoga therapy, how I certainly wouldn't be able to go away for months at a time now.
Yeah.
Even the early days of inner peace yoga therapy training had me living away from home for a couple months a year. And that's just not possible for my life currently. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I do still like to get away, but it's shorter and less frequent.
Absolutely.
Now, but it's also been a good shift from sort of consumption to creation, like the learning and apprenticing and studentship that obviously continues for any of us in yoga. We continue to practice and get curious about our patterns and things. But yeah, there was kind of like a taking up the helm that I felt I wanted to pursue and was sort of compelled to pursue with some of my own projects and kind of growing.
Well, let's talk about them. Yeah.
So where should we start?
Well, I'd love it if you could share information about your book, Pelvic Yoga Therapy. It's now in its 3rd anniversary, and you've been working on some new book-related content. Perhaps what was the catalyst for writing the book and providing this resource? Who is it really for? Share with us more about the book. And you can weave in there, how you've updated it too.
Yeah, that's been definitely part of the journey that, as we said, so much has happened since writing this manuscript. I first started writing the proposal in 2018 and then revised it and started working with my mentor, Shelley Prosco, in 2019, and then went into writing the manuscript March of 2020, which is a marker in most of our minds at this point, how the world shifted on its axis at that time. So I went into this I went back into kind of a postpartum cocoon incubation, gestation with this book project during the pandemic time with a 6-month-old infant and almost 3-year-old in tow. And I still chuckle, like, how on earth did I get that done?
Right?
But we did.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just a really kind of sweet, hunkered down, kind of devotional time in writing this book. And the proposal process, I think I want to speak to that today because it was so informative to be given the template of book proposal from Singing Dragon, who is my publisher, and just start chipping away one section at a time and doing more intentional market research on, does this book exist already? Has someone else already written this book somehow? And it was encouraging that I found it didn't exist yet. There, of course, were books on the more clinical side of pelvic pain and pelvic floor health. There were a few books on yoga's purpose of serving people with pelvic floor challenges or concerns. But there were a couple things that were kind of distinct. One was the therapeutic lens and really bringing in the tradition and philosophy of yoga as the foundation of how we're applying the practices. That piece I felt was missing and not yet represented, and felt important, of course, to include, not only to honor and respect yoga's roots, but also because it has so much value therapeutically to really look at the ethics and observances, right, of the yamas and niyamas and Samkhya theory, that there's both the changing, fluctuating human experience of our quote unquote symptoms and the unchanging self, the part of us that is always well, always intact, and how that can kind of spur us on with hopefulness and trust in like the goodness of ourselves, our body, life itself. So I wanted to make sure that was represented. The other threads also are somatic practice, right? That I see asana kind of beyond just what we do on a rectangular mat at whatever time of day that we go to class or do our personal practice. I see asana as movement, as expression, and there's a three-dimensionality to it that sometimes can get lost in a vinyasa flow structure or a hatha more linear structure. So yeah, there's really rich practices, dozens and dozens of practices, and hand-drawn illustrations by my friend and colleague Eve Andre, who illustrated the book, to bring it to life. So my initial proposal was, this is for the people who want support with their embodiment and their pelvic floor challenges to heal and gain function. My publisher said, this is a professional title. This is for the providers, for the yoga therapists, for the healthcare clinicians. And I said, okay, well, I've got my work cut out for me, and let's speak to both. So it's a very rich text for people who want to understand the therapeutic approach of yoga and weave that into their practice. Looking at scope of practice as well, like both the inclusions of our scope and the limitations of our scope, and understanding that distinct lane as a yoga professional is important. And it's embodiment focused. I really wanted to make sure that the book was not kind of a dry academic text of just pure intellect, but that it really does translate into lived experience and lifestyle and rhythm and embodiment. So that's where the illustrations and practices come in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And what are you doing these days or recently in terms of the update to it?
Yeah, well, books take time to update. Right now, a second edition is not yet in the works. And so I decided to bring the book to life with this 2-day online event called the Pelvic Yoga Book Summit.
Mm-hmm.
So pelvic yoga is similar to the title of my book. And it's a book summit specifically because what we're going to do is look at the chapter by chapter content of the book in conversation, me with other guest teachers and experts in conversation, chapter by chapter, really illuminate both what's in the book and the material, abundance of material that, of course, can't all fit in one book.
What a great idea.
So, yeah, so it's kind of like a book club.
Yeah.
And a really great opportunity to deepen and integrate as you read and bring it to life through the guided practices that be part of the live summit.
Let's come back to that a little bit more in a minute, because it's really exciting and I just love the idea and I want to hear more about what's happening in that summit. So we'll circle back to that. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, I want to kind of talk about whole person. Mm-hmm. It's in the title of your book. You've already mentioned it in just sort of the laying down the framework of the book, but let's talk about why we're looking at the whole person rather than a diagnosis and how important that is for pelvic health.
Yeah. So from a theory standpoint, for a hot second, right, we know in yoga that we are multifaceted beings. We're in this physical body.
Meat suit.
Yeah, meat suit, as some people say. It's not my favorite term, but
Me neither.
but it works.
It
You know,
did, it kind of like takes you right into sort of like the, I don't know, just the lowest common denominator of it, right? It takes it down a notch. It takes it from its preeminent place, definitely down a lot of notches, right?
Yeah, it's real like the grit down and kind of down and dirty, like I am an earthling and I have
Yes.
flesh and
Yes.
blood and
Mm-hmm.
bone. And that's true, right? And we can see the distinct differences in more of a straight up biomedical model that might look at the symptoms, the condition, label it as a diagnosis, and then seek to eradicate those symptoms. What's the surgery? What's the pill? What's the fix for that problem? And I like to think of a symptom as information. Pain is sensation. A symptom is information. And if we look at that as actually wisdom, that it's getting our attention in some way, it's showing us what our needs are that maybe aren't yet met in the ways that they're asking to be met, that is a really different lens. That's a really different vantage point to come from when we're looking for relief from a quote unquote symptom. Like, I am a person in this body that has its own wisdom. And if it's a call for a response in terms of how we care for, how we tend to ourselves, that creates an emboldening, an empowering stance for the person to start investigating and getting curious. And again, meeting themselves in all those different ways. So for a few years, coming into getting the book proposal and the book contract, I ran an online program, and it was more focused on the physical practices and exercises with bits and pieces of whole person inquiry, looking at our mental, emotional self, our spiritual fulfillment, certain lifestyle aspects of things. And I saw people getting really, really good results. And that if they weren't addressing those other aspects of self, if they were kind of looking for maybe the quick fix or like, just give me the program, just give me the right exercises, and stayed with just the meat suit, so to speak, right? That their results would either be fleeting, they would get the result and then they would fall off the wagon and stop doing their practice and their symptoms would return, or they weren't as lasting of results if they weren't able yet, for whatever reason, right? I'm not judging. There are times where it's hard to meet ourselves with grace and compassion and skill and wisdom. And yet that's our work, I think, in large part, is how do we mature in those ways that we need to mature so that we can hold ourselves lovingly, consistently accountable, not perfect, but imperfectly, consistently enough, right? That we actually treat ourselves well. And there's all kinds of different ways that shows up for people, whether it's their conditioned beliefs, whether it's shame around pelvic function, sexuality, etc., whether it's their bandwidth as householders, parents, caregivers, full-time employees. Like, we get to address that whole person's needs and get them resourced and supported enough that they can take action in the ways that are needed for their healing or their benefit, and be able to actually maintain that, right? So there's not just the personal threat of responsibility, there also is the systemic or collective broader world that we live in, and how is that impacting that person. So all those factors matter, and that's a bit of the puzzle and problem solving that I really enjoy when I'm working with people, is to really meet them and see them and get to know them in the ways that help illuminate, like, oh, if we tug on these two threads, it's going to make a huge impact on everything else for you. So let's focus here and here, in addition to maybe the specific pelvic exercise or, postures that they might be doing.
What you've said is just such a beautiful illustration of how yoga therapy works, right? I know we're talking about pelvic health, and we're also talking about the whole person, and that is the model for yoga therapy. And it's really cool that you had this witnessing or observing real world, like when we do just this part of the whole person, the changes, the impact are not as long lasting or fleeting. And when we bring in the other aspects of the self, we can really deepen the whole healing process. It's funny, after this, I'm hosting a Zoom with Joseph LePage, and he often talks about relative and absolute yoga therapy. And I just love those terms, right? And that's what we're talking about here too. So there's relative yoga therapy where we're doing tools and techniques, and the absolute is more of the whole person and really the intention of yoga. And as yoga therapists, we can do both. And some clients only want relative, right? And that's the meeting them where they are part that you mentioned. And yet real big change oftentimes comes from the absolute and lasting change. The other part is that it's so individualized then, right? And that we know is true about yoga therapy. So that's why a sequence of techniques isn't the answer for everybody. It's limiting in two respects. It's limiting because it doesn't bring in the whole person. And it's also limiting in that it may not be the right for the person in the moment. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was one of the kind of tricky, sticky parts in writing the book. And, in these years of now feeling like I'm ready to develop a professional training in this realm based on the book and material I've learned and integrated since writing the book is protocols, right? Like we can look at patterns. We can look at what's evident in the research. We can take our clinical expertise and do our best to kind of package that up as a formula of like, if this, then X, Y, and Z, right? And do these things if you have whatever condition. And that works some of the time, right? Like it definitely works some of the time. And we get to individualize it when we're working with people directly one-on-one. And so I like to tell people, and Shelly and I just talked a little bit yesterday about this on an Instagram live, like there's no shortage of information online, right? Like if you want free advice, if you want a YouTube practice, if you want anonymity, right? Like if you just want to do some stuff that might help without the investment or potential vulnerability of being in a relationship with a provider,
right?
Like a therapist. There's a lot of stuff online, right, that you can look for. But I like to just give people the discernment, put it on their radar of like, if it seems too good to be true, if it seems too linear, straightforward, quick fix, just hold it lightly and trust your instincts as you trial that practice and modify it, adapt it as you see fit, right? And that's the kind of work that we can do when we're in dialogue with people or in a relationship with a client where they get to really actually have that heart-to-heart hand-holding customization of their practice. Because with pelvic health, again, it can be so complex, so multifactorial that we need to look at the kaleidoscope of that person's experience and figure out what is the best starting point and the best path forward that can address sometimes the multitude of different symptoms that they might have going on, or lifestyle challenges or stressors they might have going on, and like what's really going to move the needle the most for that person. So
awesome. Let's dig into the book a little bit more. The book Off the Shelf, as well as the book Summit, because I know the book Summit is a reflection and a conversation about the book. So share with us maybe some of the content or frameworks in the book, and then also share with us more about the book Summit.
Yeah, so I'm going to read the dedication from the book. To my mother for encouraging me to teach, To my daughters, for joyful play and big feelings, and to everyone bravely exploring embodiment. So, bravely exploring embodiment really kind of sums up like my approach, my ethics, my principles in how I do life as a person, woman, mother, etc., as well as professionally. And one of the distinctions here, I think, that's important to mention is the piece that is trauma informed methods, right? And like, how did we create a society that we even need to teach people how to be ethical and clear and good to each other with these trauma informed principles? So rather than having a statement that I am a safe space or my programs are a safe space, I use the word brave. And I believe that safety is something that we create together. It's a collaborative, shared effort and responsibility that I know my scope and ethics and boundaries, and I see the people that are working with me as whole and intact and capable, and that they must make their own choices for themselves. We're helping them build or restore their capacity to do that for themselves if that has been lost or injured or taken from them in some way. So the first part of the book really lays that groundwork of what is the role of a yoga therapist, what is the philosophical foundation of what yoga is, and therefore what yoga therapy is as a practice, and the body wisdom, the somatic wisdom from a nervous system lens to really start to understand what are the response patterns that I have or the reaction patterns that I have that, again, are not a problem. They're not maladaptive because they've served a purpose, at least at some point in time, if not for a season of time, that those patterns of behavior and nervous system response, those imprints are wisdom, right? That is on purpose, that our body does the thing it does, or that we socially behave a way that we behave. And so starting to really see that wisdom and reclaim what we want to reclaim in the present as far as new options, new awareness, new insight, and more options for our capacity, right? So instead of a window of tolerance that has been narrowed, reframing that as a window of freedom. And we're looking at widening our capacity and our options and our genuine expression so that we can be more of who we truly are. So that's the first section. Then we go into kind of more like deep dive, nitty gritty, like pelvic anatomy, breath anatomy and physiology, pelvic conditions, pelvic awareness, specifically locally, right? Like really understanding not only what can quote unquote go wrong in someone's pelvic function if they're having X, Y, or Z symptom, but also what we need to have it be right. Like, how do we actually create the conditions for the breath and the pelvic diaphragm to do what they know how to do and be able to restore that function? So again, we're kind of flipping the pathology scope or lens kind of 180 and looking at what do we need to thrive? What do we need for well-being? And every pelvis, right? Every person has a pelvis and every pelvic diaphragm needs, again, kind of a simplified protocol of baseline things like breathing well, moving well, coordination and timing, endurance, strength, relaxation. And so it gives us a map out of our quote unquote dysfunction or symptoms, gives us a map home to the inherent wisdom and function of how our body is so brilliantly designed to work well. And we support that in the ways that we practice. And then we dive into a little bit more like assessment and key practices, both in being and doing. So it was important to me in this book that restorative yoga, somatic inquiry, yoga nidra is woven in. There's a whole chapter on being and how when we can kind of clear the slate, recalibrate, yield and actually feel supported, how that in and of itself can be so restorative and beneficial and healing. And that creates kind of a ground for moving more efficiently when we come into an asana sequence, for example, right? So rather than just coming into our practice and going through sort of a rote sequence or prescription of like, okay, this is the sheet from my PT and I'm going to go from A to B to C and just go through the motions. There's the qualitative aspects of our awareness and how we guide ourselves internally and how we track change over time. That for me has been one of the most powerful aspects of my own practice and in doing this work with others, those qualitative, subtle aspects of how we do whatever it is that we do. And that is served well and supported by being that we bring into any doing, if that makes sense. Lastly, the book finishes up with cultivating commitment and the gifts of belonging, right? So we zoom in and get nitty gritty into practices and techniques and anatomy. And then we zoom back out and look at how do we sustain this practice over the long term, that this is not just, I'm having this symptom, so I'll practice for 6 weeks and then I'm done and go back to living how I live, but really taking it up again as ownership of, this is my body to take care of until my last breath. And how can I bring this reverence and curiosity and even joy with me to sustain my practice, my commitment to myself that might happen to look like a yoga practice or other movement practices. And the gifts of belonging, like that chapter 13 that I, for the longest time, could not name, could not get a title, went back and forth on even different topics of how I wanted to close the book, even
It's a
cut it out at
beautiful
one
title.
point. Yeah, even cut it out at one point, like, we don't need 13. And I was like, no, we do. And it's landing on 13 because the number 13 itself is symbolic with divine feminine and the spiritual connotations there. And so that chapter in particular for me has continued to like keep on giving as the book has come out into the world, and my own journeys with some family ruptures that have happened and integrating those pieces personally and finding deeper roots of belonging in myself, in my own body, with my existing, current, and chosen family structure. Yeah, sexuality included, right? That there's just been continually unfurling benefits and gifts of that core message of belonging for me as the author. And I hope that that comes through for everyone that reads the book as well, that we belong to ourselves first and always. And what a gift to belong to ourselves and be able to give genuinely who we are to the people who care for us and love us and deserve to get all of us right, as genuinely as we can.
Makes me feel a little bit welled up inside to hear you speak like that. Yeah, very important. Yeah. And so let's close on the book summit. So tell us how it's structured, how folks can participate, who the guest presenters or speakers are, and all that.
I'm so excited. I've been working on this for a year. And then we had a unexpected relocation as a family. So it's like, okay, pause, scratch record. We're doing this in 2025 instead.
Yeah.
So I'm like beyond excited that this is existing and live, and we are registering people actively right now for the Pelvic Yoga Book Summit. And the summit itself is 2 full days of learning and practicing together on May 2 and 3. Shelley Prosco and I will do kind of a kickoff event, a live conversation called The Foreword for the Summer, and she wrote the foreword for my book. That's on Tuesday, April 22. And so people can register to join us globally, virtually, from anywhere in the world with a free ticket to attend live. So live attendance as a standalone thing, free ticket, put your email in and you're golden. You're good. For folks who are really wanting time to digest the material and take this at their own pace and rewatch presentations and redo practices for a full year of unlimited access, that means you need to upgrade for the all access pass. And so right now the all access pass is only $97. It's on a pre-sale discount up until the time we go live for the all access pass. And that also does include bonus content. So there's 3 additional hours of goodness waiting for people with that paid ticket. There's a what you need to know about the nervous system presentation that I'm preparing, pelvic awareness and imagery that I'm preparing, and a live Q&A with me after the summit, where you get to actually ask your questions and share your takeaways and fine tune your understanding of what you took in during the live summit and get more personalized support for the journey ahead, right? Okay, I'm questioning this. I wasn't sure about what I felt in that practice. What about X, Y, and Z? That live Q&A is a chance for us to come together as a community and actually steer the ship, right? From all the information in the summit. For me, it's got to come into kind of a funnel, a consolidation where it becomes personally relevant and meaningful. And that's why we're doing a live Q&A after the summit. So yeah, I'm really excited. We have an incredible lineup for speakers. There's myself, of course, Shelley Prosco, Rebecca Sebastian, Kristen Hauser, who's going to speak on nervous system and menstruation. She's an acupuncturist and dear friend of mine. Leela Stewart with experiential anatomy. Robin Rothenberg with breath and sound for pelvic integrity. Stephanie Munaz and I are going to have a real heart-to-heart on grief and resilience, love and loss, and how we find our way through that. Julia Romano and I will be talking about the continuum of womanhood and potentially motherhood, right? So postpartum, peri, and postmenopause and considerations there for our well-being and pelvic health. And then ultimately at the end of the summit, Susie Zobrist and I will speak about that last chapter, the gifts of belonging, and some of the threads that we're finding in terms of trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive work with pelvic care, specifically looking at embodied consent. And how do we know when our body's actually saying, nope, pause, hold the phone, or yes, continue full speed ahead, right? Because sometimes what can happen in a clinical setting, someone goes to see their pelvic floor PT or their pelvic floor specialist or their OB-GYN for their exam, and there's a lot of authority in that environment that can lead to implied consent. We just kind of grit through it or say, okay, that's what I'm here for. I guess I have to just lay back and do the thing that they're going to do. And for me, it's really important, especially when there's been any kind of trauma history or sexual assault history, and then that person wants care for their pelvic floor symptoms. It is so important that we know we're in the driver's seat and that we can ask for what we need, that we can pause, take a beat, or to have a breath, or ask a question, and really have a more dialogue, more collaborative relationship with a provider, even within those healthcare settings where sometimes we default to their authority and override our own knowing or override what our body is actually ready for. And so just flipping that whole conversation on its head, I think is important, that we're now at a time where women and people are understanding that they have more choice, that they are sovereign, that they deserve to be heard and respected in any care setting. And yoga therapy and working outside of that medical model has given people a lot of restoration with those skills, those instincts of really self-efficacy. So not just sovereignty as a value or an inherent birthright piece of the puzzle, but self-efficacy, skill in action, that we know we have a voice, we can use our voice, and we can collaborate for our own benefit in any kind of care that we're seeking.
So important. I feel like we could talk for a lot longer. This was great. I'm excited for your summit. I'll include the links in the show notes so people can register live or take in the upgrade, the replay, and have all the materials for longer, because that sounds like the way to go. And you could do both, right?
Yeah, you can definitely attend live. I will just mention, since there's yoga professionals that listen to this show, that to get your Con Ed, we are approved for 16 hours.
Great.
Yeah, we're approved with IAYT, and you do have to get your all access pass for your certificate of completion, so we can track that you're actually doing hours.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yep.
Great. Wonderful, Cheri. So
Thank
good
you.
to be in conversation with you again, and all the best on all the things. And I'm excited to see what happens next.
Thank you so much.
If you'd like to learn more about who we are and what we do, visit us at innerpeaceyogatherapy.com.